All right, so let's get into the week 12 recap. In week 12, we were talking about the sort of goodness of equality, or asking a question about to what extent equality all by itself is a good thing. So this followed on pretty well from the week 11 content, which was about liberal feminism. And that argument that we looked at in week 11 had a lot of talk about inequality and how inequality was sort of bad. Now, he was talking about a specific inequality between women in general and men in general. So the idea there is that, of course, if inequality is bad, then it must be remedied, and the remedy to inequality is equality, so equality is good. It's kind of the reasoning there. So, and that's very intuitive, right? We think that a more equal society is a good one, generally speaking. And so here in week 12, we're thinking a little bit harder about that to see what that means. And if that intuition is actually accurate or makes sense or has the consequences that we want it to. And this is a common thing that you do in philosophy. You do often start from your intuitions, but you can't just allow your intuitions to go unexamined, to go unchecked. You have to try and plug them in to sort of cases and see what the consequences of your intuitions are in these usually hypothetical cases, and then on the basis of those consequences, see whether you think your your intuitions need to be reevaluated. This process is generally referred to as reflective equilibrium. That name for the process, I think, is due to John Rawls, who we will talk about, well, who I mentioned briefly, I think, in the lecture for, wait, no, I don't mention him at all. John Rawls is a political philosopher who is the kind of counterpart to Robert Nozick. We've read a couple of Nozick's pieces so far, or you're reading one this week, or you did read one in this week. He's a counterpart in that they're both American political philosophers, and they put forward kind of opposed views of what the just society is, of the goodness of equality, of what justice is, so on and so forth. Now, what did we look at particularly this week? Well, we had an argument from Derek Parfit, whom we've seen before. He is the author of the repugnant conclusion argument that we looked at earlier in the term. And then, of course, Robert Nozick and the Wilt Chamberlain argument. These are both pretty well-known arguments, and they sort of look at and criticize the goodness or the possible goodness of equality in two different ways. So Parfit's argument is the leveling down argument. And the way this goes is fairly straightforward. You can achieve equality by, all you have to do to achieve equality is to put people on the same level. Now, of course, if people are on different levels, you can do this in a number of ways. You can work by only bringing the people at the top down, right? And that's the kind of thing that Parfit is going to be arguing against, the leveling down objection, right? So just achieving equality simply by bringing some people down and then doing nothing else, that is the method that Parfit is criticizing. Now, of course, that is only one method. So when you think of it that way, you think of numerous methods and which one of them Parfit is criticizing. That allows you to see that Parfit is not saying that equality is bad, right? So I saw a number of people in their summaries, active readings, and discussion sort of suggesting that Parfit was saying that an equal society is not something that we should strive for. That's not what he's saying. He's saying that equality is not good. It's not good to simply create equality. If it were good to simply create equality, then any method would be acceptable. But Parfit is simply saying that not every method is acceptable, so equality is not good all by itself. It's not intrinsically good. However, so this, the leveling down method, Parfit's not going to accept. A leveling up method, he would accept. So if you achieved equality simply by bringing the people at the bottom up to the level of top, that would be great. Parfit would be fine with it. And intuitively, that's what we all, well, that's what most of us are talking about when we speak of equality in a positive fashion. We're saying, oh yeah, we got to bring all these other people up to the level of whoever has the best quality of life, or sometimes we might be talking about sort of three levels. There's people here at the acceptable baseline, there's people above it, there's people below the acceptable baseline, and when we talk about equality, we mean, well, we need to bring everyone up to at least the baseline. Above that, they're on their own, right? So there's all kinds of ways that we can talk about this. Parfit is going to be generally okay with any method of achieving equality that at least improves things for some people. So leveling down, no. Leveling up, yes. Then there's a sort of question of to what extent you can, what strategies where you do a little bit of both will be acceptable, right? So as a matter of fact, when we talk about sort of distributive justice, which is something that John Rawls, whom I mentioned a little bit earlier, is very keen on, things like progressive taxation, where people who make more money pay a larger percentage of their income, and then that money is taken and sort of used for general social programs. Instead of just leveling down or just leveling up, that kind of thing is a little bit of this, right? A little bit of both. There is not a general way of figuring out which type of hybrid strategy Parfit would accept. Obviously, something which brought people up at the top way down and then the people at the bottom up just a little is probably not going to be acceptable, right? So it's a case-by-case basis once you get into a hybrid strategy. And again, I think that's fairly intuitive. We, with some exceptions, probably accept that it is okay to make people who have more, who can do more, do a bit more, right? For people who, for some reason, can't. Now, there are some people, and probably a fairly significant number, although perhaps not a fairly significant percentage, who think that people who are well off have no obligation at all to help people who are not so well off, and that any type of bringing down at all in order to help those who are sort of not well off will be sort of bad. We see that, we will see that with one of Nozick's arguments next week about taxation. But I think for the most part, it's intuitive. And now when I mean intuitive, I mean most people think that it's acceptable to bring people at the top down a little bit in order to bring people at the bottom up a good deal. So again, Parfit is simply attacking the idea that equality is good all by itself, which means that equality achieved by any means is good. He's saying, no, not by any means. Not when it's only harming other people and not raising the absolute level of the people sort of in the lower levels. Now, it's a different story with the Wilt Chamberlain argument. So again, Nozick is talking about how to evaluate different patterns of distribution, right? So that's the little premises with D1 and D2. He's talking about distributions of goods or wealth or whatever. And his idea is that any patterned form of distribution is going to be unjust. Patterned here means somehow fixed or altered by the intervention of the state, probably. He doesn't specifically say the intervention of the state, but that's generally what he's referring to. But probably any sort of intervention in general, which is sort of non-consensual or coercive, right? And we'll again see what that means in week 13 with Nozick, another argument from Nozick. So a redistributive scheme with like a progressive taxation, or as again we'll see next week, taxation in general, enforces a pattern distribution. That is, it is not a distribution which results from people simply moving their property around, their wealth around as they will. So the Wilt-Chamberlain argument is the idea that Wilt-Chamberlain has a lot more money than all of his fans, all of the people that came to watch him play basketball. Now, this might seem unfair from an egalitarian perspective. Why should Wilt-Chamberlain have so much money and his fans have so little? And we're not even entering into the issue of value judgments about, how much money should professional athletes have? Should they be so wealthy compared to people who do useful things like, build bridges or teach or are plumbers or whatever, right? We're not getting into that realm here. It's simply that here's a person who has a lot more wealth than everyone else. Now, the reason why this argument is so compelling to so many, so interesting, is that we have this massive disparity of wealth between a highly paid professional athlete and their fans. But there's a certain sense in which this appears to be perfectly just, despite what egalitarianism would say, because people willingly paid their money to go see Wilt-Chamberlain play. And again, you could replicate this, you could update it for LeBron James or whatever athlete gets paid a tremendous amount of money and people just love to watch them play, right? So even if this increases the disparity in wealth between the relevant athlete and their fans, this is, according to Nozick, perfectly just, because no one said you must pay $5. $5, not that cheap. You must pay $100 to come watch LeBron James play, Wilt-Chamberlain play, right? No one forced them to do that. They did it because they wanted to, right? And the idea is that any patterned distribution of goods is going to reduce people's liberty, right? And that's what Nozick is talking about, is the main reason why pattern distributions are always going to be unjust is that they reduce people's liberty by sort of saying, no, we know you want to do this with your wealth, but you can't, right? Even though, and we're assuming that the wealth they have is legitimately gotten, we're not getting into, so we're sort of glossing over the possibility and the actuality in the cases of some wealthy people, I'm sure, that some of their wealth is ill-gotten. We're not even thinking about that. Even assuming that everyone got their wealth in a legitimate way, an unequal and inegalitarian distribution of wealth is going to be just. But of course, egalitarianism, or at least some principle of equality, is going to say, no, that's not just. So what Nozick is doing is saying, look, the principle of equality is just wrong. And here's why it's wrong in a fairly straightforward fashion, right? Because it reduces liberty. And so Nozick, being a libertarian, it makes sense that he would think something like this. And again, what makes the argument so interesting is that so many people just think that this must be wrong. But they can't figure out why, because the argument is pretty simple, pretty straightforward, and has rather few controversial assumptions baked into it. So in this week, what we've been talking about is two ways of questioning the goodness of equality. With Parfit, we're not saying that equality is bad or that equality is never desirable. We're saying simply that certain methods of achieving it are unacceptable. We get a slightly stronger view from Nozick, where it looks like any egalitarian system, any egalitarian distribution is going to be unjust and therefore bad, right? So he has a much stronger view that equality is simply bad because it is going to necessarily, he thinks, have to be enforced against people's will, against people's liberty, reducing the amount of choice that they have or something to that effect. So his view is a much stronger one. Hopefully that clears some things up a little bit. I know that a lot of people thought that Parfit's argument was a bit funny. Hopefully that's been cleared up, and hopefully also Nozick's argument has been illuminated.